The Holocaust was a time in history from January 30th, 1933, when Adolf Hitler became the Chancellor of Germany, to May 8th, 1945, when the war in Europe officially ended. It was arguably the darkest time in human history, when Jews and other minority groups lost all rights and were persecuted horribly in Germany and other parts of Europe. Adolf Hitler was elected Chancellor of Germany in January of 1933. The Chancellor is the head of the German government, much like the President of the United States. He was part of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or the Nazi Party. The Nazis slowly gained control of the German government, turning it into a dictatorship with Hitler as its leader. They arrested other parties' leaders and banned their meetings. After the German equivalent to Parliament building was burned, all hope of German democracy was gone. The Nazis began taking away people's rights. They no longer had the rights of freedom of speech or freedom of the press. One of the Nazis' most helpful form of oppression in the early days was propaganda. The weekly newspaper called The Attacker in English featured cartoons making fun of Jews, and the words, "The Jews are our misfortune," were printed in large print at the bottom of each issue. About 500,000 copies were sold weekly by 1938. Many Jews attempted to escape Germany before things could get any worse. It took years to complete all of the paperwork necessary to legally leave the country. Many families sent their children first out of desperation. By the autumn of 1941, it was almost impossible for a Jewish person to leave the country. Jewish people were slowly being isolated from German society. They were fired from their jobs, removed from public schools, and had their businesses and property confiscated by the government. Books that were written by Jewish authors were even burned. They also had to label all of their clothing with the Star of David so everyone would know who they were. In the following video, Paul Temmer, a Holocaust survivor, discusses these feelings of discrimination.
We didn't understand why they were passing all these new laws, and the discussions involved that these are just hoodlums and gangsters who got into politics, and this will blow over after a while, because the German people were such a marvelous people. They were great philosophers, great scientists, so on. They wouldn't allow this to happen. So we didn't believe it, and we thought it's just going to blow over. Maybe it's just a bad time in history, that things will change. And we couldn't believe, but step by step, they were pressing on us more and more. And things happened that were very disturbing. The first incident was when I was out in the boarding school, I believe in about 1943 or so. Some of the children were talking about the Jews, that they are no good and they're bad and so on. Now, I didn't know I was Jewish or I had a Jewish background. We never discussed it. And I was raised at that point as a Lutheran, and I asked them, well, why would you say the Jews are no good? And they told me all sorts of things, and I thought it was terrible. And my grandparents brought me home, and my grandfather, when I arrived back at home from this boarding school, for some reason he told me I have to go home, had a jacket for me to wear because it was cold. And on the jacket was a Jewish star. And I asked him, what is that for? He says, that's what we have to wear now. I said, why? He says, because we're Jewish. But I said, I'm Lutheran. I said, but you have Jewish parents, and anybody who was a Jew is always a Jew. And I found it humiliating. I found it difficult that I had to wear it. It took me a long time that people would just single me out and just look at me with that big yellow star on my jacket. And that was my first instance of feeling discriminated and to be picked out, to be different. I always believed I was like everybody else.
The disturbing things that Mr. Temmer was talking about were called concentration camps, where Jews and others were worked and starved to death, extermination camps, where mass killings occurred on a regular basis, and ghettos. Ghettos were places the Nazis established, mostly in Poland after they invaded it, for Jews to live cut off from the rest of the world. They lacked the necessary food, water, and space needed to support such a large population. Many people died of deprivation and starvation here. Soon, the government began sending Jews and other minority groups, like the Roma people or homosexuals, to their deaths in concentration camps. Friends, families, and even spouses were separated. In the following video, a Holocaust survivor describes being separated from her mother and sister at the Auschwitz concentration camp.
just remember sitting there with my mother and my little sister in that car. Yeah. And then we got out, and they said my mother to go on one side with my little sister and me to the other side. And I asked whether I could go with them, and they said they just pushed me to the other side. And then I asked whether I could visit them, and then somebody said, yes, they are in the H camp. And I asked, what is the H camp? And they said, Himmel.
First people sent to these camps were the weakest. This included the sick, the old, the weak, and the very young. The first of 5 mass gas killing centers began on March 17, 1942. Only Jews were gassed, but thousands of non-Jewish minorities were worked and starved to death daily. At one of the largest camps, Auschwitz, as many as 12,000 Jews were killed a day. In the following video, Fred Wojciechowski talks about feeding the prisoners at a concentration camp where he worked.
Basically, the main thing was to get them something to eat, because like the jungle says, the survivors is going to live. People, and there was people in there that I was feeding somebody that maybe on the ground can't even hardly get up. Try to give him some soup or something, and somebody would come up and try to grab that right off my hand. Of course, my gun was sitting beside me, so as he got a little more belligerent, I had to really sock him with that gun. I wasn't going to shoot him, but I told him I would shoot him if he come a little closer, and I think he understood what I meant. I don't know what nationality he was. But that was our biggest fault. There was a lot of them, like they said, we gave 1 or 2 meals and they died. Their stomachs were so shrunk up and everything, the food was too much for them. They should have been probably fed just a broth of some kind without any solid meat in it and stuff like that, but we just gave them what we thought we could give them. And they were just melted down and hardly be able to chew it. A lot of them didn't even have to.
You have probably heard of Anne Frank. She was the young girl who wrote in her diary when she was in hiding during the Nazi occupation. What you might not know about her was that she was an aspiring writer. She wrote many short stories while in hiding, and also a book of beautiful sentences, which is a collection of sentences that she liked from other authors. The video you are seeing now is one of the only known video footage of Anne Frank, where she can be seen looking out her window while her neighbor gets married. The Frank family was unfortunately discovered on August 4, 1944. The German government evacuated many camps in 1944. The inmates were sent on guarded marches, so they were distanced from the advancing enemy forces. These death marches resulted in the deaths of about 250,000 to 375,000 people. At this point, the German government was growing weak. It became apparent that they were going to lose this war. In Hitler's last political statement, he blamed the war on international Jewry and its helpers, and urged the German government to follow the strict observance of the racial laws with merciless resistance against the universal poisoners of all people, the Jews. It appeared that the government did not agree with him, and Adolf Hitler committed suicide on April 30, 1945. 1 week later, on May 8, 1945, Germany officially surrendered World War II. The Holocaust will always be remembered as a very dark time in history. Millions of people of the Jewish faith and other minority groups were stripped of their rights as people. We will always mourn the deaths of all of the innocent people that were killed for no other reason than their ethnicity and faith.